Hey students, so you should have your paper all set up for your tips for good composition, some notes that you're going to take today, and a little drawing that you're going to do. So today we're going to learn about composition and what all of that means. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to write down the definition in the top section of your paper. So composition is the arrangement of elements in an artwork. So that's what you're going to write down. So I'm going to explain a little bit about composition. Composition is super, super important. Once you understand the elements of art, then you need to start figuring out where those elements are going to go, right? And understanding the principles of art is very much tied into composition. You're going to hear a lot about some of our principles of art when we talk about the tips for good composition, because the principles are all about how we use those elements of art, right? So when it says that composition is the arrangement of elements in an artwork, we're talking about where things go in your artwork. So the first step to making any kind of artwork is figuring out an idea, right? What are you going to make? And then you have to figure out where all those things that you're going to put in your drawing are going to go. So if you're doing a landscape, for example, where's the house going to go if you're going to have a house in your landscape? Where are the trees? Is there going to be a path? Are there going to be any people? Are there going to be any animals? Where you place things in a work of art is really, really important. So that's what we're going to start learning about today. So our first tip for a good composition is, so number one. So our first tip is all about where you place the focal point. So number one is avoid placing the focal point in the middle. Use rule of thirds. So on your paper, you're going to go ahead and write this down. In that little box that says 1 on it. And then we're going to talk about what is a focal point and what does it mean to use rule of thirds. So we talked a little bit about focal points when we learned about the principles of art. Do you remember which principle of art is all about the focal point? Hopefully you remember that is emphasis. Emphasis is all about creating a focal point in a work of art, right? So your focal point is where your eye is drawn to in an artwork. When you look at an artwork, where does your eye go first? And there could be more than one focal point in an artwork. This artwork here, this is by Alexander Calder. And this is a painting by Alexander Calder. Calder also did a lot of sculptures, and he's a really interesting artist. Definitely look at some of his work sometime. So this is a more abstract painting, and we have a very, very clear focal point, right? So when you're making a work of art, you want to think about what's the most important thing in the image. What do you want the viewer to see first? And what do you want to emphasize? So again, using our understanding of emphasis to create that focal point and make sure it stands out. So if we're looking at this focal point here, like this is very clearly a focal point, right? It's different than all the other things. So we've got contrast, making this more emphasized. And it's also a different shape than the other things. So we have contrast in shape, contrast in color. Those are the kinds of things that make a focal point have emphasis. So this is one example of creating a focal point. So now the other part of the tip talks about using rule of thirds. So what does that mean? Basically, if you were to divide your paper into thirds in both directions, so thirds going vertically and thirds going horizontally, where those lines intersect is the most pleasing place to put your focal point. So use the rule of thirds as a guide, as a place, just knowing that it's a good place to put your focal point. As we can see in some of these drawings, it becomes more balanced if you have your focal point in one of those intersections. Generally, the focal point in an artwork, if there's a person in it, is always the eyes or the face, because we as people, we're social beings, and we automatically go, our eye is going to go to other people's eyes, right? We want to connect, we want to see other people. So that is often where the focal point is going to go. So whether when you're trying to do an artwork with a person, consider where their eyes are, where the face is in the artwork. Otherwise, it's often in the foreground as well, so you might think about placing a focal point closer to the viewer in the foreground. Generally has more detail, might be darker in value than the things that are farther away, right? And that's going to also draw our attention to it. So consider all those things when you're creating a focal point. So let's look at this work of art. This is one of my favorite paintings by a really famous artist named Rene Magritte. So let's start by learning a little bit more about Magritte, and then we're going to look a little closer and talk about the focal points in this artwork. So Magritte, you might recognize this bowler hat. He's a very famous artist, and you probably recognize this painting as well. So he's a Belgian surrealist painter, lived in the turn of the 1900s up until 1967, and most of his artwork is most famous for his hyper-realistic style and depicting these illogical compositions. So when I mean illogical compositions, I'm talking about, look, why in the world is there a green apple in front of his face just floating there? Doesn't make any sense. And that's kind of surrealism for you as well. So super skilled artist used this hyper-realistic style. Very cool stuff. So this artwork is called The Son of Man, done in 1946. Let's go back to our other artwork. Okay, so this is called Pandora's Box, which gives us some really great sort of imagery as to what the meaning of this artwork is. But let's not focus too much on the meaning right now. Let's just look at the composition. So my question for you is, where do you think the focal point is in this painting? So for me, when I look at this painting, the first thing my eye notices is this bright white of the rose. And this, for me, becomes the primary focal point. And then right away, I notice, oh, and here's a person. And so my secondary focal point for me is the bowler hat and the back of this guy's head, because automatically I think there's a person. If there was a face there, that would definitely be number one, but because we're looking at the back of his head, that becomes the secondary focal point. So I'm saying primary and secondary because you can have multiple focal points in an artwork, and sometimes there are, like, generally there's one thing that draws our eye in first, and then there are other things that bring our eye, move our eye to around the artwork, right? Like we're creating a sense of movement as well, which is actually, that's helpful for having a focal point. So let's look at this artwork with our grid and see if the rule of thirds ended up matching up. Okay, look at this. So this rose isn't quite on that intersection, but very close, and definitely not in the middle, right? If this was right in the middle, it would definitely take away from our whole composition. And then here, this other one, which might have been your primary focal point. The other thing about focal points is that it's different for everyone. So what draws your eye in might be different than what draws my eye in to an artwork because of the way that you relate to the artwork and what is important to you. So that's kind of a really interesting thing to keep in mind, is it's a little bit subjective. Generally, we notice the things that stand out to us, and they stand out because of contrast, because of connection with the subject matter, and some very specific things that artists can use to make it really clear. So that is this painting. Okay, so now we're on to tip number 2. So you're going to write this down in your box right underneath tip number 1. 2 is use diagonals to create movement. The viewer's eye moves across the page. So this is where we start to talk about another principle of art: movement. So we've already talked about emphasis and the creation of a focal point and how important that is. Now we need to talk about movement, and these relate to one another pretty closely, right? We actually already mentioned movement just a little bit ago. So how the eye moves around a work of art. So if we look at some of these drawings here, horizontal shapes and lines are generally pretty stable. They're pretty static. They just are kind of calming, and that can be the type of mood that you want in a work of art: still, calm, static. That's totally fine. totally great way to approach an artwork if that's the mood that you want. But everything that you do in a work of art should be intentional, right? You want to specifically try to create the mood that you want to create. So horizontal shapes and lines, that's what they create. Now, if you use vertical shapes and lines, they definitely it implies that energy and growth are falling. So it's also kind of static, but in a different way, and has a different kind of tension than the horizontal lines and shapes do. Right? Again, a different kind of mood and feeling. Now, when we come to diagonal shapes and lines, now we have a sense of most dynamic, and it definitely has a sense of movement. So these are both pretty static, stationary, stable, those kinds of descriptors. And now here we've got the sense of movement of this path. We've got this creature coming in from the corner. All of these are diagonal shapes, especially with this person and the cape coming in from the other corner. So lots of dynamic movement, which helps make it a more interesting composition. These two are fine. They're just maybe not quite as interesting as they could be, which, maybe you're going for something not quite as interesting, and that's fine too. If we look at the bottom two here, we can see the way that using diagonals can help make something look like it's moving, which is kind of another way to create movement. Movement doesn't necessarily have to always be about how your eye moves. It might also be, well, our eye moves when we also think that that thing is moving, right? That object or that person or that creature. So thinking about the placement of where you place your shapes and your lines, whether they're horizontal, vertical, or diagonal, definitely helps create a sense of like a specific mood that you might want. And then also in terms of composition and placement, thinking about things like the triangle, which is all diagonals. Triangles are really great in composition because threes are a really good number, and then it also just helps really direct your eye to specific areas. So triangles are really great, and circles help emphasize a focal point, which is also really helpful. So if our movement of our eye is moving up this triangle here, then clearly here is the focal point on this little image. Another really great thing you can do using diagonals also to create emphasis, which is to actually point objects in your artwork towards your focal point, almost as if they were arrows. It's a really great way to just very effectively create a sense of movement towards your focal point. So we're going to look again at this painting. This is a great example of using shapes to create diagonals and create movement. So these shapes are positioned in a diagonal arrangement, right? These shapes here, these shapes back here, these draw your eye towards the focal point, and then these shapes draw your eye back to the rest of the artwork. So because of the way that these shapes are placed, they create a sense of movement, and because they're diagonally placed, we have even more of a sense of movement than if they were just horizontal or vertical. So that's one way to create diagonals in your composition, is by placing shapes in that specific arrangement. Okay, so let's look at this painting again. So here is our Pandora's Box painting by Magritte. Love this painting so much. So we also have some really great examples of diagonals in this painting. Again, we start by looking at our focal point, maybe over here, maybe here first, and then we see all of these diagonal lines that are creating this bridge that they're on. So here we've got these diagonal lines going back, and they're taking our eye back to this area in the artwork. And so now we start to see that this is a whole city back here. There's more going on. There's buildings and maybe a courtyard back here. So our eye gets drawn back and we start to wonder what the city is like. There's also a diagonal line. If we follow this line of the roofs, it goes slowly diagonally down from back up here to down here. So we also get this sense of movement across the artwork as well. And that kind of brings us back to our main characters here in the foreground. So not only do we have these lines sort of parallel and repeated back here, but we also have this line of the sidewalk as well. So all of these lines that are diagonal across this artwork help create that sense of movement and really tie this composition together. So these 2 tips are your first tips for a good composition, and now we're going to go back to our paper and see what we need to do next.
Hey students, so we are back looking at our paper here. So your page right now should look something like this. You now have your definition written at the top. You've got your first tip number 1 here. I drew a little example of the rule of thirds just so I would have a sense of what that meant. And then tip number 2 here. So then in this larger section, you are going to do a drawn example of these 2 tips combined together. So you can draw whatever you want in this area. It could be something representational like a face, a person, a landscape, an animal, whatever you want. Think about what you want that focal point to be and then go from there. It could also be something more abstract, like just lines and shapes and maybe color if you've got it. So totally up to you how you do it. I would suggest starting with dividing that paper into thirds, at least really lightly, just so you get a sense of where the best places to put your focal point are. So like if you were to do some really light dotted lines, and you wouldn't have to measure or anything, but just kind of getting a vague sense of this is it divided into thirds, again, both directions, right? So we get thirds horizontally and vertically. So now I can see where I might want to place the focal point. So do a little drawing. I suggest drawing the sort of edges of the paper or the composition in a rectangle here. You can do the rectangle like I've done it where it's sort of landscape, but you can also do the rectangle in more of like a portrait position as well. It's completely up to you how you want to do it, but do a drawing of some kind. Make sure you've got a focal point, and it's using rule of thirds, and also some diagonals, so diagonal shapes, diagonal lines, things placed in a diagonal way. Have fun with it. You can draw whatever you want, but just make sure that you've got your tips for good composition that you're using. So that's all for this week, and next week you're going to learn about tips 3 and 4. And then tip 5 will be the following week, and we're going to do one last project of the year, sort of bringing all of these tips together into more of like a final finished drawing. All right, so take a really good photo of this page and submit it on Canvas. It is due on Sunday night. All right, happy drawing.